Well, hello, and welcome to the National Endowment for the Arts' third webinar in our Learning from Abroad series on international design initiatives and partnerships. I'm Jason Schubach, the Director of the Design Programs here at the National Endowment for the Arts. We'll be hearing from three designers who will discuss the intersection of universal and landscape design in their work, and what can be learned and built upon from their international community, the international community. I'd like to thank Valerie Fletcher, Executive Director of the Institute for Human-Centered Design, for helping us organize this conversation. And I'll turn the mic over to her in a second. But before we hear from her and our distinguished presenters, a few housekeeping notes. You're all muted, and you will only be able to hear us. We will give a 30-minute PowerPoint presentation, followed by a Q&A session. You can submit questions and comments at any time using the Q&A box below the PowerPoint. We will do our best to address as many of these as possible during the time we have. Please do not use the raise hand button. This webinar will be posted in the webinars section of our website in a few days so you can refer to it in the future. And please join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag NEADesign. I'm going to hand things over to Valerie now. Valerie, take it away.
Jason, thank you, and thanks to the NEA for this opportunity. Jason has been an invaluable ally for ideas about design that demonstrate the power of design. So we are always in your debt for keeping the good fight going. So thanks very much. I am the table setter today and had the great opportunity to engage and invite a couple of my colleagues from around the world. Go Siem Im from Singapore and Walter Hood from the United States. And I know you will enjoy the experience of learning from them as I have over time. I represent an international organization that is all about design that makes a difference, this notion of enhancing the experience of everyone across the spectrum of ability and age through excellence in design. We care desperately about quality of design. This isn't just about function, but really about the power of design itself. The two things that underlie everything that we do is that design makes a difference. Unfortunately, it makes a profound difference sometimes in the negative. It is our intent, and I know the intent shared by my colleagues, that design makes a difference that is transformative in a positive way. The other thing that undergirds everything that we do is that variation ability is ordinary. This is not special. It is not thinking about people who are fundamentally different than you and me. This is really about the human condition. Our work has varied in geography as well as in scope, design and consulting, technical assistance, education and training, and research. We've been around since 1978, and in the last 20 years, our work has been increasingly international. We feel very strongly that the only way to do this work well is to constantly be in dialogue with people across the globe. The variety of work we do tends to be feeding. One activity feeds another. Our educational work informs our user expert lab. Our user expert lab informs our technical assistance. It has been an extraordinary process to build an organization with remarkable people where it's always about synthesis and being open to new experiences, particularly new experiences of learning from the experience of people whose life experience may be quite different from the typical designer. And one of the ways we do that is through our user expert lab. We use that term user expert to accord respect to people who have a different life experience than the typical designer. People who've developed natural experience with dealing with the challenges of our physical information communication service and or social environment, and have a great deal to teach us as designers. They are providers of data about what works. And it is our intention to always make an easy point of access for people to actually get the incredible learning and insight one gets from dealing with people who are bringing news from their own life experience, which is becoming the norm globally. Making the case for inclusive design is partly a matter of data. All of us know, and I trust all of us are wedded to the vision of our responsibility to environmental sustainability. There really is no ambiguity about the profound negative impact of long-term inattention to the protection of the planet and its health. I would suggest that for those of us who are thinking about these topics of inclusive design, our charge is really framed in terms of social sustainability and the profound positive impact of the last 100 years and of what we as people have contributed to that. We live longer and survive more across the globe by far than any time in human history. But it doesn't mean that that isn't without a call to action for designers. The most dramatic of those catalysts for action is the phenomenon of aging, and this is true in every continent of the world. You can see in the image before you, aging in the 21st century, if you count from just 1950 to 2050, that 100-year period, a sharp, clean arc that goes from a very modest phenomenon of aging to a stunning new reality of the human population. We are dealing with a situation today when we have one country in the world with 30% of the population over 60. By 2050, 64 countries will be in exactly that place. The second catalyst for these ideas is disability. Functional limitation is a phenomenon that is our good fortune in many ways because people survive birth, accidents, and illness. We live long enough to experience something of the functional limitation that many of us won't know until we're 70 or 80. But at this point, even given limited data, 1 in 7 people on the planet are people with a functional limitation that results in some level of disability. And 80% of them live in the developing world. When we think about the Millennium Guidelines of the UN, this is a critical issue to embed into those guidelines. It can seem overwhelming. Human diversity and human ability are such broad categories, but to think in a way that is manageable, you can wrap your arms around, we're really thinking about 3 broad categories. Basically, physical issues, sensory issues, and brain-based issues. And we can't give short shrift to any one of them. This is really the context of our lives that we're thinking about when we're designing environments of any kind. And to imagine people across this set of variety. One of the things I like to do is depict the overlap of shared values between environmental sustainability and what we think of as a core element of social sustainability, this notion of inclusive or universal design. And I think we share 4 big ideas with environmental sustainability. When we're talking about diversity, we're not talking about species diversity as much as diversity of ability, age, and culture. When we're talking about interdependence and arguing the case for the reality of interdependence, we're really talking about collective good fortune. That we are fortunate that we live in a time in which our lives will likely be characterized by an illness, an injury, something that will change our abilities, but we will survive and have the same personalities and the same expectation of full participation we have always had. The third, and data-driven, data about people's experience of what works. We really need to constantly build our understanding about human experience and the human experience of people who are quite different from the traditional concerns in accessibility of people who use wheeled mobility or who are literally blind. We're looking at a much greater diversity. We need to constantly inform ourselves about that experience. And the long view. Investing today is an investment in the future, and we can't afford to do anything else. This notion of universal design is a response to a changed reality. This idea was really born simultaneously in the United States and in parts of Europe in the late 90s. Really a framework for the design of places, things, information, communication, and policy focused on the person and on the widest range of people in the widest range of situation. From our perspective, arguing about terminology is not a particularly valuable use of time. We see universal design, inclusive design, design for all, in our own choice, human-centered design of everything with everyone in mind, as really talking about the same vision of inclusion. The principles of universal design were actually coined in the United States by a group of 5 organizations just in 1997, and they are in common use around the world. I'm pleased to say that my predecessor at Adaptive Environments, Elaine Ostroff, was one of those participants. There was 5 organizations in the United States, and those principles were copyrighted to the Center for Universal Design at the State University of North Carolina at Raleigh. This is an infrastructure of a shared global policy. We are talking about a global phenomenon that the NEA has embraced. Global dialogue as a priority is something that makes complete sense today. For us, part of the way we work globally is by referencing back to the international policies that we share with all of the other nations in the world that are members of the UN. So the World Health Organization, part of the UN, redefined disability as a human experience in 2001. They basically said functional limitation is a universal human experience. It's not about a discrete group of people fundamentally different from the typical. They equalize mental and physical reasons for limitations of function. For the first time, that was embraced by the members of the UN, an extraordinary accomplishment. More significantly for designers, they define disability as a contextual variable. Complicated wording, but a big idea that designers really need to unpack a bit. The notion if functional limitation is a phenomenon of all of our lives, then the context of our lives is really what makes the difference. That the context can be designed to anticipate human diversity, the reality of human diversity, and to create a world that is enabling and supportive of everyone. And they're talking wisely about all the environments that make a difference. The physical, the communication, the information, policy, and social. Certainly those of us that are completely dependent on our technology would be quick to agree that communication and information environments are as central to our daily quality of life as our physical environments. Even back in 2001, when universal design was still a term of known to few, the World Health Organization embraced universal design as the most promising framework for identifying facilitators that would minimize disability and support independence and full community integration. The second international policy that we can point to, far more significant in parts of the world outside the United States, is the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, and the priority direction that has gotten the most enthusiastic endorsement around the world and triggered all kinds of initiatives and policies and programs, ensuring enabling and supporting environments as the key to aging as part of the community. And the last one is actually one that is the most recent, 2006. It's the third supplement to the International Treaty on Human Rights, in this case, the human rights of people with disabilities. And at this point, we've seen 158 nations have signed on to this. 137 nations have ratified. And this has given hope and a means of talking about expectations and believing in opportunity from places like our friends in the picture in Kathmandu to people all across the world with often only internet access to being able to imagine what's possible. Last thoughts, just share a couple of publications that may be of value, especially for those of you mostly interested in landscape. Inclusive Urban Design by our colleague David Bonnet in London, terrific publication that's just come out in 2013, and a publication supported by our friends at the NEA, The Inclusive City, Design Solutions for Buildings, Neighborhoods, and Urban Spaces by Susan Goldsman and Daniel Isofano. A last point, impediments and opportunities moving forward. We do need more data about the edges of the spectrum of human experience, about what works that can inform designers. Designers need more information to be able to do this work with the kind of zeal and confidence that we need. We need to sound the alarm that barrier removal is valuable, inevitable, necessary, but far less substantial than the aspiration to create facilitating environments. We need to banish the idea of universal access as an adequate term for what we're talking about, We're really talking about the synthetic and dynamic process of a human activity we call design. Universal, inclusive, human-centered design is at the heart of the work that we're talking about. Thanks very much. I'm going to defer to my colleagues. And introducing Walter.
Great, thank you so much. Walter, we're ready for you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with colleagues around the globe on universal design plus landscape design. Today we're speaking from Oakland, California, and we'll be sort of showing and sharing some of the work of Hood Design. I'd like to sort of start out by just stating that Hood Design is a studio practice here in Oakland, California, and our primary concern has to do more around this idea of culture and how design is centered around people living in places. And places, as we've just heard, are very diverse. One of the things that we're most interested in are those landscapes in which people spend most of their time. We refer to these landscapes as these mundane places or the kind of everyday. I'd like to share with you 3 projects, 1 realized, 2 in the planning stages, that take regularly mundane spaces and try to find the other sides to them so that people who use them, whether they're using them just in the day-to-day or through some spectacle, have a way of sort of understanding how people live in a place. They're all 3 geographically diverse. One project is centered here in the Bay Area, another is in Philadelphia, and I think the final one is in Florida. Hopefully we can shed some light into how we sort of understand and think that design matters, even at its most simplest sort of installation, from crosswalks to roads to how people sort of live and play in an area. This first image is of the newsletter from Splashpad Park. Splashpad Park was designed here in Oakland, California 10 years ago, and it started out with a very simple mission. How do we get people across a very busy road? It was an MTC grant that was basically for bulb outs and crosswalks. At our first meeting, we had over 100 people show up. That was less about crosswalks, but more about how can we make a place. In working with the neighborhood, then we were able to sort of think about what was this mundane landscape, which was simply placed under a freeway, and it had a huge intersection that people crossed. There was a fountain installed that was never working, and through a long, arduous community process, we were able to arrive at a hybrid landscape that took into consideration how do we slow traffic, but how do we also make a place in one of the most mundane types of landscapes here in California, which is beneath a freeway. Next. So the early images begin to suggest places of movement as well as places where people would stay. It's now Splashpad Park is one of the, I would say, one of the most popular farmers markets every Saturday that happens, again, in the shadow of a freeway. But it's also a sculptural piece that tries to take the dynamic of the larger landscape, being of Lake Merritt, being of downtown Oakland, being of the freeway, and merging all of these pieces together into what we think of as a hybrid landscape. It's a park at once, it's a plaza at once, it's a street at once, and it's commingling all of these pieces together. Halfway through the project, again, to get people interested, we were able to sort of talk about its history and talk about bringing some of the historic features back. The community got very much involved. We put their names in lights. We were able to fundraise for fountains and other sort of equities that the basic project grant could not cover. We fundraised over $100,000 to add those special amenities. So again, starting with very small infrastructural funds and leading to something much larger and much dynamic. And today it's a place, as we started out with, that has a thriving website, a thriving social media sort of infrastructure that allows for this physical space to have a very, very dense program for all types of people to come and share. And it's one of the most diverse landscapes that I've ever been in, from male gender to race and age. This next project is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, moving across to the East Coast. And this project is about a city that has a very rich history, but in certain parts of places where we have a very dense sort of historical setting, other places that are not immediately tied to it somehow feel like they have to create new identity. Here, Pearl Street, which is north of Center City, is a small alley. And the alley was a place in which people lived but had turned their backs to the alley. The first image I showed you was a mapping of historic alleys in Philadelphia. So through a 6-month process, we were able to, again, bring a community, a very small community, along a very narrow 18-foot wide right-of-way behind their sort of major entry, bringing this diverse group of people together. One group, I would say, focused primarily on social services, another group, meaning in the blocks, focused again on more arts, and another group on the cultural setting of Chinatown. And through a set of activities, we were able to bring people together in the space under a common goal to make tables and chairs. So getting rid of their kind of personal sort of attitudes about what the space would be and trying to create a collective idea of what they should be. So over time, we were able then to go back and talk about the basic necessities of the alley and the street, as well as how the blocks sort of work together, and then beginning to sort of create a story for how everyone who uses the space daily, from the people going for social services to the artists who were moving into the area, and again through the Chinatown, which is moving to the northerly sort of Liberties area, as well as to the development community, how they could all share the same thing within the alley. So our ideas range from greening strategies to getting people to really use the backsides of their buildings. We have concepts such as fresh windows, working with people to sort of begin to sort of open up the backs of their buildings, creating dynamic thresholds, again, making it accessible, redoing the ground, paving, curb cuts, providing ramping opportunities so that everyone has the same way to sort of understand this landscape. And throughout the project, then, we were able to graft onto these very simple pieces of infrastructure projects that could happen over a period of time, from art installations, again, to very simple things as opening up the backsides of buildings, particularly where certain social services are going on, where people are eating behind solid walls, making them more visible, to art installations that are happening inside of the building, making them more visible, to cafes and restaurants that turn their back to the alley, making them more visible. And we think that through these small, incremental sort of pieces and designs, that they begin to add up to a collective and diverse, set of landscapes. And again, I think one of the things to think about with the Philadelphia project is not trying to create a master plan or one big thing that happens everywhere, but taking small incremental projects so that over time they actually have a dialogue with one another. And lastly, the project in Miami is called Oasis, and this is set 10 miles north of Miami. And this project is a public art project in which we were asked to come in and look at a 2.5-mile roadway. And I'm showing images of, the first is of that roadway. In Miami, as we know, gets lots of rain, very hot, very muggy, very low elevation. In this landscape, there are no trees, very little curb cuts, very little spaces for people to move in a car-oriented landscape. Our first project was to make people aware of these things. And the first things that we do, again, is put people in those landscapes. To stand outside, even in December on this barren street, is a task indeed. There is no shade, and one goes for the first tree. But as we move through the project, we begin to sort of see that another way of educating people on the places in which they live and the problems that happen there is to make those things visible. So our first project is actually a temporary installation where we basically map three-dimensionally where the issues of access and the issues of infrastructure come into conflict. And here we have 7-foot walkway. And you can sort of see here, if you were in a wheelchair or if you were walking, you would have no place to walk. So in most cases, people are walking in the middle of the road. This project is an artful way to get, again, engineers, designers alike to kind of see that this working in autonomy never really adds up, and that there has to be these larger ideas or larger visions for how, no matter how small of these incremental projects, how they can actually begin to work together. And here in our second phase of the project, we've broken the city, this 2 miles, into 4 quadrants so that they'd be easily understood. And then through each one of them, our piece, the Oases, tries to take the infrastructure that I showed you in the previous slides and make a larger sculptural effect in the landscape. And here, the first one I'm showing you is at a K-12 school, and we actually have a huge ball field next to the road. And talking with the community as well as the school, we're making this now into one of the first Oases, which will be a place where water can be infiltrated, but also a place where planting and different infrastructures can happen on the street level. That creates a temporal effect and a qualitative landscape in which, again, people have places of respite, but the landscape is actually encouraged to be much more performance-based. And in each case, we try to make this appear sort of through opening up the landscape, whether it's in the public right-of-way or in adjacent parcels, and trying to, again, create a sculptural effect so that the landscape does not seem ordinary, even though it's ordinary. It's extraordinary through this kind of sculptural massing. And so these mundane landscapes become then these exuberant, very rich places. And you can imagine as you're going along this 2-mile sort of stretch of road, they will be punctuated by these places where you're able to sort of understand flora, fauna, but also the cultural workings of the neighborhood, whether it's the police station that I'm showing you here, or it's an abandoned or used auto parts place. And these oases, as we're going through, they allowed us to have a conversation not only with the public at large, but also with the engineers who are doing most of the work here in Florida. So again, starting out with the splash pad project that showed how do we sort of work within these existing infrastructures. I think Oases begins to suggest that we can begin to push against, the culture of the type of infrastructure projects that pretty much are not inclusive to people who sometimes, particularly in Opa-locka, who are of a different economic and a different class and a different sort of race. So again, beginning to sort of find the beauty in the mundane begins to suggest that there's this equity that we don't need to talk about, but this equity that begins to emerge by looking closer at places. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Walter. This is no doubt going to be fodder for our conversation that will begin after we hear from our colleague from Singapore, Ms. Goh Siam Im, a colleague of mine over the last few years, where I've had the great privilege of appreciating the stunning level of commitment in Singapore, in the design community, in government, even in the development community, to really look at this as endemic to their vision of great design. So I'm very pleased to introduce Goh Siam Im as the Director of the Universal Design Development Department at the Building and Construction Authority in Singapore. Ms. Im?
Thank you, Verily. Thank you for giving me a chance to share with all on the development of universal design in Singapore. I will use the sensory garden at BCA Academy to show how we can and do to cater to the needs of all the users. Singapore, as you know, is a small city-state with a population of 5.4 million people. As with many developed countries, our population is aging and aging fast. We estimate that 1 in 5 residents will be 65 years and above in the year 2030. With aging, we face several challenges: weak knees, poor eyesight, poor memory, and all other disabilities. An accessible and user-friendly built environment would be a key enabler for older persons and persons with disabilities to continue with their daily activities independently. Therefore, to support aging in place and an inclusive society, BCA launched the Accessibility Master Plans in 2006 to address the rapid aging issue and to pursue the upstream goal of livability and to create a city for all ages. One of the key initiatives of the master plan is the promotion of universal design in the built environment. The 3 principles that are important in universal design are accessibility, usability, and diversity, that is, making it possible for most people to use. The same principles will apply to the park and open spaces. Parks have to be accessible for all. We want children, mothers with babies in pram, older persons, and persons with disabilities to enjoy the walk in the park. For persons with disabilities, other than persons with mobility limitation, we need to consider persons with sensory challenges as well. Parks should have provisions that promote and improve well-being. Areas for interactions, resting are important. Wellness and fitness equipment would be a bonus. In addition, we want to consider providing sensory experience for park users. Planting boxes raised above the ground to allow a person in a wheelchair to see, to touch, and to smell will go a long way in enhancing his experience in the park. Other features such as explanation in Braille will help a visually impaired person enjoy the park too. To demonstrate the UD principles in park to our students, visitors, building industry professionals, architects, and designers, BCA built the Sensory Garden at the BCA Academy in 2007. This was built in consultation with Mr. Miyake, a Japanese landscape architect. The Sensory Garden not just enhances the visual environment of the academy, but is a proof of concept on how to invite exploration through sight, sound, touch, and smell. Let me start with the sense of touch. Many people ask the question, can a visually impaired person enjoy the walk in the park? He cannot see. Yeah, but one must not forget that other than his visual impairment, he has other senses: touch, smell, and hearing. We can pay extra attention to this area in our design to allow him the full enjoyment of the place. Yes, and that's what we do in the Sensory Garden. Tactile guide can guide him around. Clever use of texture enables him to enjoy and visualize the place. Sound can delight. Sound can be a great way for wayfinding too. For example, the musical pipes at the sensory garden would not just delight children but adults too. The sound produced by water is calming. It can also help one to recognize the place. The sweet smell of roses reminds one of love. The herbal plants, rosemary, basil leaves, remind me of Mom's cooking. Yeah, a dedicated plot of herbal plants will certainly be a delight to the park and garden users. It would be better if it could be raised to a level where one who is on wheelchair or standing can touch and smell as well. Let's not forget to mention that the distinctive smell of certain plants will be a good marker for a visually impaired person as well. Colors show the different seasons in places with 4 seasons. In Singapore, where we have sunlight all year round, what we need to do is to carefully choose the right plants to give a delightful sight. The use of physical features such as the red post you see in the picture not just provides skill but a marker for wayfinding too. After we have built the sensory garden at BCA Academy, the Housing and Development Board, there's the government board that built public housing, has built a 1.1 hectare neighborhood park in Toa Payoh town using the sensory garden concept. And it's proven to be a good place for school children in the neighborhood to learn about the needs of persons with disability. As a promoter of universal design, we are often asked the question, must all parks be designed with a sensory garden theme to be considered universal design? Well, the answer is not necessarily so. The sensory garden at BCA Academy was built as a proof of concept. It helps to raise the awareness of the needs of different users, old or young persons, or persons with different abilities. It has illustrated that a garden designed with persons with disability in mind can be as interesting and enriching. Understanding their needs and skillfully integrate them with the design will certainly produce a great piece of work. I'm glad to share with you that through the last years of UD promotion, we have seen greater awareness amongst the architects, landscape architects, parks developers on the application of UD concept in the design of parks and gardens. One exemplary example is the Garden by the Bay. Garden by the Bay has just been recently awarded the BCA UD Mark Platinum. Well, you can come to see for yourself. It's been designed with consideration for the needs of all users. It is accessible at all levels, whether you are walking at the treetop or you're walking at the club gardens. You could see a pictures where people are walking, and whether you're on wheelchair or you are old, which you need walking aids, you could still enjoy the walk in the air. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. M. I want to also share with our audience that the landscape architect for the BCA garden and the other sensory garden is actually, Miyake is trained in the U.S. So though he is based in Japan and has done extraordinary work in or we can be proud to say he was trained in landscape architecture at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I also want to acknowledge one other thing about the extraordinary work that's being done in Singapore. It's one of the parts of the world where I'm very heartened when I have had the privilege of being in the group of people in government and in the design world in Singapore that are committed around those issues. and to see how many young people have risen into roles of leadership in this effort. It's something we'd love to see elsewhere. We're now going to move into questions, and we welcome your questions. So please do share those with us. You can put them into your question and answer section. I'm just going to one of our colleagues is actually a colleague who has presented on the earlier one of the earlier sessions in the series, Camilla Buchanan from the UK. Interested to hear views on universal design in intangible contexts, particularly in public services which have to perform very different functions. For some people, they need to be invisible and seamlessly fit into people's lives. For others, they have to be significantly more supportive and enabling. We design for such different needs in non-tangible environments.
Question.
Thanks. Can I turn to my colleagues for some thoughts on that? And I'm also happy to contribute. Ms. Im? Walter?
Can you elaborate on the question a little bit? I'm somewhat...
It's partly, if this idea of universal design or inclusive design is going to really make a difference, part of it is to create places where you don't notice anything unusual. I mean, much of this is intangible. It has to make a difference for people for whom barriers have been removed, where you've thought about what do people need to be able to fully participate and enjoy the space. But I think it's really asking, how do you get people to understand what this is about if the ideal project doesn't look very different? The ideal project is seamless.
Right. Well, I'll just take a stab at this. I mean, for us, I think it's very easy to get caught in the standardization of accessibility. And I see this even with my students, so that, you know, if I'm starting with a landscape that's just, say, topographically unique, that we start out with saying, I need to make an ADA ramp, versus thinking about maybe it's the idea of ramping. And I do think that landscape, probably a little more than buildings, that, you know, we have another scale, another set of sensorial intangibles that can begin to provide the same experience to people, whether I'm going up a hill, going down a hill, crossing a threshold, coming to an edge, but just how we begin to navigate landscape if we don't somehow fall back on what I call the techniques that allow us to do it, versus thinking more, you know, spatially and sensorily. And I think the last presentation began to suggest that, you know, through our sensorial understandings of space, that we can begin to actually make more people aware of those places, you know, whether it's through smell, touch, taste, you know, all of these things. And I think if we start there, maybe that gets us closer.
Thank you, Walter. Ms. Im? Ms. Im, I think one of the things that I would just suggest is an interesting phenomenon of Singapore is the amount of training that you've done with government officials and with design practitioners. It's quite astonishing the depth that you've already achieved in a rather quick few years, so that everyone is at least conversant in these ideas, which really makes a difference in terms of being able to get to that idea that it is seamlessly integrated into how people think, that notion of anticipating human diversity. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Indeed, we started late in looking into accessibility in the built environment. We started to regulate the requirement to provide accessibility only in 1990. And very little has been emphasized in the past. And people are just code compliance. And after many years of this being code compliance, we know that it is not enough. A code or regulations is not adequate to address the needs of all different users. You know, one size doesn't fit all. Yes, the code is a good guide is the first start. And that was the reason why in 2006 we started looking into promoting universal design or UD in a very big way. It is a good way to really raise the awareness. It happens every day. You see an older person limping away. It's just such a common sight, but you didn't realize that you could improve the environment by just making it easy for the person to walk, by providing handrail at the appropriate height to help the person. And all this little minute detail really need to be thought. Thought. I use the word thought is that because it is so common that, but unfortunately people is too busy to have that common sense. And you really need to make the effort to raise the awareness. And you were right. We actually go around conducting talks, not just to the general public, to the design communities, but to the government agency, the government officers who has to really to understand the needs so that they put that into the policy, in the policies of whatever they're going to do, whether it's providing infrastructure or administration.
Thank you, Ms. Beam. I think that's a very
Yeah,
good point. It is about thinking
yeah,
differently. Inevitably, that's the
yeah.
baseline. Walter, one of the things that I'd like to ask you to share more of your practice and thinking about has to do with this notion of we need more data. We need to understand what makes a difference. And I think part of what I've loved about your work and your process out of Hood Studio is this notion of openness to learning directly from ordinary folks, being invited to talk about their experience of what is and to imagine what might be. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Um, yes, I mean, it's been, something that has been central to our work the last 20 years, and it comes out of, I would say more than anything, the Berkeley School, having people like Claire Cooper Marcus, House That Matters, Randy Hester, the strong sort of more sociological, I guess, interest, that came out of the West Coast in the 60s and 70s. But for me, being a student of that, I found very, often that a lot of those tools and techniques had, again, become very standardized ways in which, by the time participation has become mandated by local municipalities, it's become 3 meetings, post-its, and, we have 3 different schemes. And I think it's gotten sort of far off a feel from the more sociological aspect of how people live in place. And so the thing that we like to do is go to those places and not only meet with people, but try to get them to enter into a relationship with us so that they feel comfortable in sharing with us and sharing, I mean, from the most speculative to the most mundane aspects. And through that sharing, we found that it's not what people are telling us that they want, but it's us having that experience there with them begins to shape how we might see something in that landscape that then we can offer to them as part of a dialogue. And I'll give you the example, like in Opelika, we went walking one day down the street. This is the Florida Project. And people looked at us and was like, these people must not be from here. They're walking. And so immediately they started talking to us, but we had to walk first. Where, I think a lot of the other colleagues that have been working there, I asked them, these are engineers, I asked them, have you walked the 2.1 miles? And of course they hadn't. They've driven it in their car. And so again, once you condition yourself to look at places and look at people in a different way, it gets in the way of understanding it. And I would say we get this question all the time, that what is the process? And we go out of our way in every place to actually formulate a different process. So no two processes are alike. And so that really forces us and forces our clients to enter into a relationship, one that's really special and one that's particular.
Thank you, Walter. I think that notion that it cannot be formulaic. It can't be those 3 meetings and the 3 schemes, and out of that you get meaningful information about human experience. Thank you for that. One of the things that I'd like to query Ms. M about is a fascination from what I've observed in Singapore, and this is absolutely woven through the progress today on things like a platinum award to a developer working with their designers. But the developers calling the shots for projects where they're investing a great deal of money, and they are saying this is part of what we're doing. I'd have to say it's one of the few places in the world where developers are always at the table. And I'm dying to ask Ms. M, what is your conversion method to get the developers to embrace these ideas as valuable, good outcomes?
Yeah. We believe in this 3P collaboration: people, private, and public sector collaboration. When we started with a code review, the accessibility code review, and this is a code where we are going to regulate, which means they are going to comply. The only way to have this buy-in, to invite them into the committee, and they are part of this committee, besides the person with disability, besides the expert users that you mentioned, we also invite the other government agency who are the major developers of infrastructure. So this is a kind of a tripartite committee where you actually get them together to believe that unless you work together, you understand each other's needs. And we, of course, by formulating this code, we moderate and make sure that it won't be too much like what you call compliance costs. That means we do take care of them. And at the same time, we believe that we must encourage them to embrace universal design, to embrace it, to go beyond the code compliance. So we introduced things like Universal Design Award, and now it's substituted by this two-stage certification we call UD Mark. And we found this quite useful to them. Some developer would like to brand themselves, and if they are the forerunner of universal design adopters, they are seen to be, very forward looking. So we encourage them. We in fact bring them around to the tour, to the world. The last time when we visited Boston, we brought them along as well, and they actually experienced for the first time, whether it's in Japan, Boston, or in Europe, they see for themselves what they mean by a good design, universal designs that cater to the needs of the people. Have I answered the question?
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Yes, that answers the
Yeah,
question. They are always at the table, and now you've
yeah,
converted them successfully.
yeah.
Next question, I'd like to actually query, let's start with Walter. This has to do with students. It's partly students, it's partly practitioners. One of the things that we have the opportunity to do, and I think of it as my good fortune, that we are approached pretty steadily by young people in particular, and that's mostly students, graduate students, undergraduate students, and then young practitioners who are passionate about this idea of design that is transformative for human experience, this notion of inclusion. And they have, in many cases, told me the same story over and over again, that they feel isolated, that they were not affirmed in during their studies, that they often feel a bit like fish out of water, driven by an idea that doesn't appear to have a great deal of currency around them. And I've begun to think that there is a scattered tribe, and that part of our job is to identify and connect them. But I want to know, how do we change that? This ought not be one over here and one over there. What is it about design education that needs to integrate a notion of this kind of consequential design? Walter, could you pick that up?
I think that's a very, relevant question. Someone who's taught for over 20 years, I keep going back, to the idea, and we see this currency in landscape architecture, and maybe not so much as in architecture, where I think the profession that then has a direct relationship to the pedagogy in the institution is constantly focusing on, I call them more like sound bites. And within one decade, we might have three great sound bites. The sound bites might be sustainability, it might be accessibility, et cetera, et cetera. But we tend to sort of focus, and so we lose the sight of the entire mission. And I think, again, I try to teach my students, and we have the conversation, is how do we talk about the art that we do, and that it's not just a two-dimensional diagram, but it's three-dimensional, it's living. These are places in which people live, and how do you go about then asking questions about that? Because if I focus too much on one thing, I'm leaving out something else. And so it's this multi-dimensional aspect that we try to get students excited by. So even if I'm coming into a program and I want to do restoration work, I still understand that there's another side to it, which is design. That if I'm doing restoration of, let's say, a wildlife corridor, I still have to get people there. So I have to make beautiful stairs, I have to make beautiful ramps and other things, just as well as those interested in making those beautiful things have to understand these larger ecological pieces. And it's this dynamic, I think, that, again, if we can stay off the sound bites, if we can begin to talk about design, and design is this multidimensional sort of act and culture in which we can engage. But if we only sort of think about, oh, I want to work in poor neighborhoods, or I only want to do this kind of work, we lose, I think, the depth of what the practice can be. And so when I talk to these students who are, feeling like they're in this lost tribe, they find comfort into sort of understanding that, again, design should be different from place to place. And again, we try to push this idea of a diversity of thought, diversity of place, diversity of people. And so hopefully we can have this conversation just like we're having this conversation, where I see our work that we're doing is very different than the work that's presented in Singapore, but there's this synergy between it, because we're not talking about the projects per se, we're actually talking about the attitude about how to make it work.
Thank you, Walter. I know that the tribe is always at home in your studio and in your classes. Another question that has to do with practitioners and the challenge of getting practitioners to understand that this is about design. And I think that we in the United States in particular find ourselves with a rather entrenched habit of just tell me what I have to do. And there's all kinds of reasons why that might be true and understandable, but it is not conducive to really exciting design that goes as far as it can for people, and that really changes the human experience. How do we get past, and what are those impediments of just tell me what I have to do? Because I think that is the most deadly possible response to the idea of human-centered design, inclusive design. I'm going to ask Ms. Im to pick that initially, because you have moved very quickly from a floor of a commitment of accessibility to trying to get people to go further. And I think it's interesting that you have grappled with this, just tell me what I have to do, and you've asked them to do more. Tell us about that.
Everybody has been commenting that the Singaporeans are really quite law-abiding. We will follow any regulation that the government has set for us. But that's quite true, and most of the practitioners were just following the regulation quite closely, and that's a good thing. They try to follow quite closely, and that's also one point where we need to be always very fast about the regulation, always making it very current, very relevant at all times, and omit all those regulations or code that are really not appropriate. That's number one. The other is to really make them think beyond the regulations. Just mentioned earlier, one size doesn't fit all, and a regulation is good for certain situation, is really not suitable for all situation. And that's the reason why we promote universal design. It is really promoting this thinking process, going beyond that regulations, really thinking about the needs. It should be more user-centric than just talking about a complying with certain regulation, whether you have to have a footpath of 1.2 meter minimum to enable a wheelchair, but rather considering the kind of uh, the kind of people the users, the number of users, the kind of spaces that you really are thinking, and the ideal situation will be really to combine the needs of the user together with your sense of aesthetic, and that's the ultimate we are really promoting. We are not asking everybody to just comply with certain standard. Yes, and like Walter has mentioned, it has to be invisible. Like they say, if a good design, a good universal design is indeed invisible. It shouldn't be too ostentatious. It shouldn't really be too obvious. But at the start,
Thank you,
we really want to, yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very apt closure to our conversation this afternoon, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jason Schubach.
Well, thank you so much again to Valerie and our wonderful two presenters. This webinar will be archived later for viewing on arts.gov. If you would like information about the upcoming Design Artworks deadline or information on other webinars hosted by the NEA Design Program, please do feel free to email us at neadesign@arts.gov. And thank you so much to our fabulous presenters, and thank you to all for attending today. And we look forward to hearing from you soon. Thanks so much.